Greg Lucero is an ex-gas station attendant who was one of the founding members of the RSU. He's a dedicated Marxist-Leninist Maoist and is currently working to expand union membership, committee organizing, and workers' political power in Utah, largely which he succeeded. But there's, of course, obviously still work to be done. Where some people are revolutionary Marxists, which describes Greg, certainly, it would be remiss not to mention Greg's scholarship, which has informed his revolutionary theory. He has a degree in philosophy and is an alumnus of UVU, Utah Valley State University. Greg does voracious studies in the topics of Soviet history, economics, psychoanalysis, and philosophy. And his pursuit of knowledge, has traveled to Nepal, where he's met with the Maoists and learned a few neato things from them. So without further ado, let's put our hands together for Greg, and so we can hear about the state of the international worker.
Well, of course, as I start, I would absolutely love to thank Jacob, who is the head of our conference committee and did all of this hard work putting this event together. And of course, thanks for Paul for his wonderful introduction. I hope you'll forgive me. This is about the state of the international worker, and I hope you don't feel that it's too self-indulgent for me to include a little bit of my own story in it. Perhaps this is just a failing of my ability to reason, but I see my own story as caught up with the international worker and his or her struggles. So what is the state of the international worker? Well, one has to look no further than our own country to see at least its general state. Barack Obama has been elected president, and what included a wave of hope and optimism has led to bitter disappointment. We find the United States still engaged in some of the worst acts of imperialism, both directly, indirectly, and with a threat of the rest of the world. We are still in Iraq, where in the most conservative estimates, over 100,000 Iraqis have been killed. We continue to fund a bloody war of choice and aggression. We continue to kill our brothers and sisters in another country. We continue to exploit the resources of a sovereign country, and we continue to prop up a puppet government built only to serve American interests. He promised us that we would be out of Iraq in a year. And now we have no end in sight for this bloody imperialist war. For the good war, if it could be called a good war, Afghanistan, we are still there. We are escalating troops. The abuses of American soldiers have come to light, where they gleefully murder men, women, and children with no regard for the laws of warfare, international human rights, or the basic human decency that is embodied in all of us. Barack Obama has not ever promised to withdraw us from Iraq, and as a matter of fact is escalating this brutal war of aggression. The United States continues to support imperialist, colonialist, puppet regimes, despite the fact that Israel continued to build settlements and announced that they would continue to build settlements on the East Bank, in Gaza, in Jerusalem, as a precursor to Joe Biden arriving, which Barack Obama and Joe Biden described as a slap in the face. For all of their anger at Israel, the money has not stopped flowing. The weapons have not stopped flowing. The brutal apartheid regime, as bad or worse than South Africa, which has murdered not hundreds but thousands of Palestinians and is built upon an illegal occupation of a sovereign people continues to grow, and there's no sign of stopping. The United States continues to fund and support the narcotic, illegal, criminal regime in Colombia. They are expanding 8 military bases to carry out their imperialist war against the armed forces of Colombia. Despite Uribe carrying out illegal attacks in Ecuador, planned assassinations of revolutionary leaders, and gross violations of both international and national human rights laws, the United States shows no sign of slowing in their support for this regime. We send millions of dollars to the Philippines to prop up a criminal government that murders its own people. The examples are countless. For all of the ill of George W. Bush, at least you knew where he stood. Barack Obama is just George W. Bush with a more human face. We don't have to look any further than Arizona, Senate Bill 1070, to see the brutal, racist, apartheid nature of the American government. Our brothers and sisters are criminalized, captured, detained, deported, threatened. And if any of you have seen the statistics in Utah, it's likely that a bill will come here with overwhelming support. Europe is no better. Left and central-left governments are being swept out of power by right-wing, xenophobic, fascistic governments that preach a doctrine of hatred, of fear, and greed. The financial crisis has crippled the ability of workers to fight around the world. In the United States, there are cut government programs, there are increased corporate layoffs, and there's increased taxation on the worker. In Europe, once if not bastion, at least sanctuary for workers, benefits are being slashed, wages are being dropped, and one has to look no further than Greece, where the entire economy is being shredded for the sake of neoliberal capitalist policies. One would be well inclined to despair. Well, one would be well inclined to preach a philosophy of withdrawal, at least until more opportune times arose. 2 years ago, this is actually my second May Day event. Last year, I put together by myself a May Day event. I invited all the speakers. I paid for everything out of pocket. And of course, I'd like to thank John Goshard, because this is the second May Day event that he's been to. He was willing to help me out before that. There was another May Day event before that, a small party with people I considered friends in my house. And I gave a speech similar to what you heard. I said, you have to keep in mind, this was going on years and years and years of George W. Bush as president, and I gave a pretty despairing speech. I told people, yes, of course, reaction was prevalent everywhere, and odds are we wouldn't see any increase, we wouldn't see any progressive movements. But of course, to keep a moderate amount of hope because of Nepal and Venezuela. And what I've just said to you is essentially the same thing, that we are in a state of absolute despair. And this is a feeling shared by most leftists, at least in the United States. But that's only half the story. There are also revolutionary struggles not just being carried out, revolutionary struggles that are being successful. Probably the most famous one is Venezuela. The United States is threatening Venezuela with invasion. Part of the reason that they fund Colombian imperialism is so that they can check the Venezuelan workers. The United States has reactivated the Caribbean fleet and is conducting operations off the coast of Aruba, which is just a few miles off the coast of Venezuela, in order to threaten Hugo Chavez. But that's just it. All they can do is threaten. They are a paper tiger. Venezuela has engaged in massive projects of wealth redistribution from their vast oil reserves. People who had no future are now being given hope. Despite the media narratives of Hugo Chavez centralizing power in his control, he has begun constitutionally turning over more and more power to village, worker, and community councils. The United States, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton have accused Hugo Chavez of running guns to the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC. However, we know where all of those weapons have gone. Just a few weeks ago, Hugo Chavez gave a speech to the workers and people of Venezuela, where he declared the power of the people's militia. 45,000 AK-47s have been turned over to the men and women of Venezuela to defend against any imperialist aggression. Where before Hugo Chavez was deposed in a coup by the military with not a word, it was only through the support of the unarmed protesters that he was returned to power. There will be no second coup. The people of Venezuela are armed, and they are strong, and they are defiant. Today, a world away, people had filled the streets. People are still in the streets of a small South Asian country. Nepal, just 10 years ago, was ruled by an iron-fisted king. But today, the Maoists, demonstrating for their democratic right to control their own destiny, are posed to topple the corrupt, neoliberal, and revisionist regime. They have not fired a shot, but their revolution is heard just the same. Their leaders were hunted, brutalized, tortured, exiled, broken. But today they stand proud, defiant, against the imperialism of India and the United States. The Constitution is set to be written for Nepal by the 26th. The Maoists have illegally been removed from the government, illegally removed from the constitutional process, all for the sake of progress. But there's been no progress, because the people of Nepal support the revolutionary Maoists. They support the struggle for equality. Nepal, a small South Asian country that 10 years ago had a king, a literal king. And today, they have a constitution greater than ours. 1/3 of their constitutive assembly members are mandated to be women. And yet the United States talks about women's rights. Nepal has legalized abortion, legalized women's reproductive rights. And here in the United States, day by day, women's rights are encroached on. Nepal has legalized gay marriage. It has one of the few openly gay representatives. It has an entire commission dedicated to expanding LGBT rights. And here in the United States, we talk about civil unions and pass things like Proposition 8, which restricts gays' rights to marriage. Ultimately, the Nepali Maoists are faced with a difficult struggle. Through their People's War, they had expanded their People's Liberation Army to control all the countryside. But there was one bastion of reaction, the heart of the imperialist empire, Kathmandu, which they couldn't capture. Now, just 5 years later, Maoists are flooding the street, calling for a general strike that is crippling industry, paralyzing their political enemies, and soon enough will establish workers and people's power in what will soon be the newest revolutionary republic, Nepal. In India, the Indian government, this is extraordinarily personal for me. I was in Mumbai when the Communist Party of India Maoist was declared illegal. Sick and tired of being passed by for progress. Their homes burned, their women and children raped and murdered, all for the sake of bauxite mining. They were sick of the promises of politicians, not to give them a better life, but just to stop the horrible crimes against humanity committed against them daily. And so I saw where they had had enough. They had burned the Communist Party of India's headquarters. They had blown up several cell towers. And the Indian government had declared their party illegal. I watched with horror as a new set of troops were unleashed. These paramilitary troops were trained as special forces under a general. There were visions of armed soldiers running through dusty plains, and they said, in order to fight the Naxal, you have to live like a Naxal. These were the elite paramilitary and special operations forces that were going to murder the Naxals. But I tried to keep a happy face. The Naxal areas were surrounded. It was declared illegal for any journalist to enter or document the operations of the government. Operation Green Hunt had begun. These elite forces swarmed throughout the forests, burning villages, raping women, and executing men. But I tried to keep a happy face. I tried to show my solidarity and support with the Indian Maoists. But then the truth came out. In what the Indian government, in a sick sense of irony, called a massacre, the Naxals had managed to ambush and kill 75 of these quote-unquote elite special forces. The Naxals had sustained no casualties in their ambush. Suddenly the story changed. These were no longer elite special forces, but rather poorly trained paramilitaries, both with a lack of training, a lack of funding, and a lack of arms. The Naxals surged, expanding their controlled areas outside of their normally controlled forests into the cities. Graffiti began showing up in cities, and still is showing up in cities, along all sorts of the dusty streets. Naxals, come save us. If India continues along its path, it will be the most populous, revolutionary, communist government in the history of the world. Just 200 years ago, communists were lucky to have the Paris Commune, which lasted only a year. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the revision of the People's Republic of China, and the dissolution of the Eastern European states was a blow against the workers. For all of their problems, they at least provided a base for workers' struggles around the world. Marxist-Leninist parties revised their plans to be a simple conscience of capital. They disintegrated, they disbanded, they lost hope. But there are still lights burning among the world. Cuba, which was thought to be only a worthless puppet of the Soviet Union, stands strong and proud. They are the only Latin American country to end child malnutrition. They have more doctors internationally than the World Health Organization. And just 70 miles off the United States coast, they are still subject to embargo, they are still subject to threats, and they are still subject to open terrorism supported by the United States government. In this case, any despair, any hopelessness is misplaced. Now is the time for us to fight. Now is the time for us to struggle. We are in the heart of imperialism. Every blow that we strike resonates across the earth. So, I am calling for the creation of a non-tendency socialist organization to carry out the struggle here in Utah. It will carry out the economic struggle, it will carry out the political struggle, and it will carry out the social struggle. These United Socialists of Utah will carry out unionization. Without a union, workers cannot be secure in their position. Through collective bargaining, they can demand their rights against the capitalists who would divide them. It will also carry out direct actions. It's not enough for workers to earn scraps from capitalists. We need to begin building our own independent economic institutions outside of capitalism. Worker exchanges, worker schools, community gardens. It will also carry out the political struggle in Utah. It will fight for referendums for the people of Utah. It will fight for equal education, not based on your location and property tax and parents' income, but a universal education that grants equality and opportunity to every Utah student. It will fight for equal rights for immigrants as well as citizens. It will not allow these racist, imperialist, capitalist policies of racial profiling, deportation, broken families, and exploited workers. It will also carry out the social struggle. It will bring together neighborhoods through community organizing, and it will bring together the people of Utah on what they actually have in common, rather than their own narrow political interests. There's something that we have forgotten. We've forgotten what it's like to be strong. We've forgotten what it's like to have power. But we need to remember that we must dare to fight, and we must dare to win. Thank you.